Chapter 14. An old man changes his mind. What I can't understand is, if you don't have winter, how do you know when it's time for spring cleaning? Mrs. Pendleton looked from one girl to the other as she shook sand on the kitchen floor to get ready for scrubbing. Fernie laughed. She had no words to explain that you couldn't scrub a cookhouse floor in her village since the floor was made of hard-packed earth. You couldn't wash windows if you didn't have any glass in the openings. Where the days are warm and the nights pleasant, there is no need to shut in a window with glass. You didn't dust pictures of flowers hanging on a wall in a Mandy village. You picked fresh flowers and stuck them in your hair or made ropes of flowers over your doorway. But all this was too hard to explain. It would be equally impossible to tell the women in the village at home about the American ways. When the trials were over, that is, and a ship took them back to their own land. For there was to be such a ship, the court, called the circuit court had decreed it. To be sure, in the strange way of going from one court to another, the Americans had, quote, appealed again. Cinque had explained this and then had gone off in a carriage with the white men to another city. He had taken full weight in and Kimbo and Cali. Grabo would have gone too if he had not been working for that blacksmith. Since he had been allowed to work at the forge, Grabo went off every morning with a song on his lips like a singing man. He said it was more important to mend plows for the farmers than to go to meet the man who had been a paramount chief. The truth was that Grabo, since he had begun working with the iron he loved, had ceased to think as the others did of the ship that would take him home. If the High Court decreed that they were free to choose, Grabo would stay in America, to work at the forge and to help other slaves to freedom. Fernie glanced at Temme, with her head wrapped up in a cloth, sweeping the cobwebs from above the cook-stove. Temme had become a woman, and it had been decided that she was to be given in marriage to Bao. They would be married when Cinque came back again, in the church across the green. Would Temme and Bao choose to stay in this strange land too? Would Temme someday be sweeping cobwebs from her own chimney? Fernie started to ask, but then a sad thought came to her. Suppose Temme and Bao, with the rest of them, were sent to Cuba to slavery again. It was better to wait and not to dream until that court, they called the Supreme Court, had spoken. Meanwhile, the waiting was not a bad time, especially now that the bitter cold and the snow was gone and the world was turning green. Fernie picked up the scrub brush and got down on her knees as she saw Mrs. Pendleton doing. She laughed again. It would be a thing worth telling about at home, this, quote, spring cleaning. April 19, 1840. John Quincy Adams read no more than the date on the newspaper. Then he folded it back in his pocket and began restlessly pacing the floor of his hotel room. The date was 66 years to the day from the Battle of Lexington, where the United States of America might rightly be said to have begun. He'd been a boy, 8 years old, when the first musket shot for independence was fired. A serious-minded boy, growing up in a family deep in the struggle for freedom. And at the close of the war, he'd been old enough, in his father's eyes at least, to be present in Paris when the Treaty of Peace was signed. Harvard College had followed in a few years. The years when his father was president had been occupied in the practice of law. Then had come a new battleground, the glittering courts of Moscow, of London, of the Paris of Napoleon's empire. The battle here was to make the rest of the world respect the young republic. It had not been easy to win respect for a republic in the courts of emperors. Again, a shift of battleground to the half-finished capital built on the Potomac, in the Senate and as advisor of two presidents. Then the battle Then the battle for the presidency itself. When the 4 years in high office were over, a man might have expected the years of struggle to be over. Instead had come a shift of battleground again, back to the lawmaking body, the House of Representatives. Here to fight the long, discouraging battle for justice to the Indians, to the neighboring country of Mexico, and most pressing of all, the fight to allow the slaves to petition against slavery. We who are not slave owners are told to mind our own business, but to dislike and to oppose slavery is the business of the free men. The battle for the right of petition was not yet won. Through the long years, there had been the struggle to make worthwhile those musket shots heard 66 years ago on the road to Lexington. Now, after so many years of fighting on so many battlefields, a new battleground was offering itself. There was this request to defend the Amistad captives in the Supreme Court battle. It's 30 years since I've been in a law of court, the old man said to himself. It's too late to shift battlegrounds again. I'll see this Cinque when he comes, but I'll tell him to find another lawyer to speak for him. His mind made up, Adams pulled out his paper, the log cabin. He unfolded the thin little sheet that sold for a penny. It didn't look like much, but the editor, young Horace Greeley, had a lively way of writing and of finding the important news. It was Greeley who had requested him to take the Amistad case. He was sorry to disappoint the fiery little editor, but it was asking too much of a man of 72 to speak up in a new struggle. Adams had hardly begun to read when a tap on the door brought him to his feet. Cinque stood on the threshold. There were others with him, a tall, lean Negro, a younger one with a flower in his buttonhole, and a half-grown boy. There were several white men, too, but John Quincy Adams saw them only as statues filling the background. He took up into the eyes of the young African farmer who had, quite simply, refused to accept the role of slave, for himself or for others. The old man, who had been president of the United States, had often found himself in the presence of great men. He had known most of the leaders of his time in his own country and in Europe. He could recognize the spark of greatness when he saw it. It was visible now in the remarkable eyes, in the poise, in the smile of the young Negro in badly fitting clothes who stood waiting. "We have come, sir," Cinque said, in slow, careful English. Adams held out his hand and Cinque took it in his own, in white man fashion. Adams forgot that he was old, forgot that he had fought too many battles to begin another. He motioned the company to chairs and sat down facing Cinque. "Now tell me," he said, "just how you think I can help."